Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the Definition of Solid Waste Rule Exclusions webinar. Before I start, I want to introduce myself. I am Matt McHale, Technical Advisor with Penn TAP, the Pennsylvania Technical Assistance Program. Penn TAP is part of outreach here at Penn State University. During our webinar, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat pod in the left-hand bottom corner of the screen. I will address the questions at the end of the webinar. We are going to discuss the definition of solid waste, DSW, and updates to the rule made in 2008, 2015, and 2018. We will look at the major provisions that include the generator-controlled exclusions with strengthened requirements, the transfer-based exclusion, the definition of legitimate recycling with built-in recognition for in-process recycling and commodity-grade materials, the variance and non-waste determination provisions, and the remanufacturing exclusion for certain higher-value spent solvents. Note that the 2018 rule was finalized just a few months ago, and the EPA is currently reviewing its FAQs and guidance documents for the updated rule. The information on the rule in this webinar is preliminary. We ask that you contact the EPA or your state agency for updates on guidance. We provide some contact information later in this presentation. Let's begin with an overview of the definition of solid waste, DSW, and the 2018 DSW Final Rule. First, I'd like to take a moment to discuss what solid waste is from a regulatory perspective and why its definition is so important. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, of 1976 established the framework for national hazardous waste management. Materials regulated by the RCRA are known as solid wastes. Almost anything we throw out can be considered a solid waste. Any garbage or refuse, sludge from wastewater treatment, water supply treatment, or air pollution control facilities, and other discarded material resulting from industrial, commercial, mining, and agricultural operations, and from community activities. Hazardous wastes are a subset of solid waste. If a material is excluded from solid waste, it is also excluded from hazardous waste and not subject to RCRA regulation. That is why exclusions from the definition of solid waste are so important. The diagram on the right describes the hazardous waste identification process and how exclusions influence this process. DSW exclusions are intended to provide environmental and economic benefits. The environmental benefits include reducing the amount of waste discarded and increasing waste reuse. They also include increasing environmental safeguards to ensure that recycling is done safely and responsibly. The economic benefits include reducing feedstock and waste management costs, as well as compliance costs. The definition of solid waste has been revised several times over the past few years. The goal of the revisions has been to encourage safe and responsible recycling that benefits human health and the environment. In 2008, 2 exclusions were added to the definition of solid waste to encourage recycling. The first relates to on-site recycling and is known as the generator-controlled exclusion. The second relates to recycling performed by third parties and is called the transfer-based exclusion. The definition of legitimate recycling was also clarified. In 2015, the EPA replaced the transfer-based exclusion with the verified recycler exclusion and strengthened the definition of legitimate recycling. Later in 2015, and then again in 2018, the U.S. Court of Appeals issued and amended a decision on the rule which made some additional changes. The court vacated most provisions of the verified recycler exclusion, reinstated the transfer-based exclusion, upheld the containment and emergency preparedness provisions, and reinstated a 2008 factor in the legitimate recycling definition. In May of 2018, the rule was updated to implement the amended decisions. In the following slides, we will describe the current state of the rule and its exclusions. The 2018 DSW Final Rule incorporates the following components. First, it retains the 2008 generator-controlled exclusion for hazardous secondary material recycled under the control of the generator. This applies to recycling on-site, recycling off-site under the same company's control, and recycling with a toll manufacturer. Second, it reinstates the transfer-based exclusion and vacates the verified recycler exclusion that was included in the 2015 Final Rule. The reinstated transfer-based exclusion requires a reasonable effort to audit the recycling facility prior to sending material. The verified recycler exclusion required a variance to be obtained before a recycler accepted the materials to be recycled. The 2018 rule retains new flexible approaches in the legitimacy definition for closed-loop recycling and commodity-grade recycled materials. It also retains a remanufacturing exclusion for higher-value hazardous solvents which are remanufactured into commercial-grade products. We will discuss these elements in more detail over the next few slides. Let's start with the generator-controlled exclusion. The generator-controlled exclusion is intended to increase the recycling of hazardous secondary materials reclaimed by the generator. To satisfy the definition of generator-controlled, the material must be on-site at the generating company or within the same company at a different site or controlled by certain tolling agreements at a tolling manufacturer. Tolling is an arrangement between two companies in which one performs a step or several steps in a manufacturing process for another. The material moves from one company to the tolling manufacturer, which performs a process and returns the material to that company. The 2015 revisions to the generator-controlled exclusion that are still in effect include record keeping for same company and toll manufacturing reclamation, as well as an amendment to the speculative accumulation provision to add a record keeping requirement. The following revisions are also still in effect. A requirement for notification as a condition of the exclusion, a requirement to document legitimate recycling, the addition of emergency preparedness and response conditions, and a codification of the definition of contained. Let's shift now to the second exclusion. The transfer-based exclusion was restored as a result of a 2017 court decision, which vacated the verified recycler exclusion. It requires the generator to make reasonable efforts to ensure that transferred materials will be recycled properly. As I mentioned previously, the verified recycler exclusion had required a variance to be obtained before a recycler accepted the materials to be recycled. The 2018 Final Rule does retain several provisions from the now vacated verified recycler exclusion. Retained provisions include allowing certain petroleum catalysts to be recycled, adding a standard for containment of materials prior to recycling, and requiring emergency preparedness and response measures. I would like to talk a bit more about the definition of contained. One major issue with the 2008 DSW Final Rule raised by states and environmental groups was the lack of a codified standard for being contained, which could result in mismanagement during storage. The final 2015 DSW rule defined contain to mean a unit, including a land-based unit, such as a pile, that meets the following criteria, which was retained in the 2018 rule. The unit is in good condition, with no leaks or other continuing or intermittent unpermitted releases of the hazardous secondary materials to the environment, and is designed as appropriate for the hazardous secondary materials to prevent releases of hazardous secondary materials to the environment. Unpermitted releases are releases that are not covered by a permit, such as a permit to discharge to water or air, and may include, but are not limited to, releases through surface transport by precipitation runoff, releases to soil and groundwater, wind-blown dust, fugitive air emissions, and catastrophic unit failures. The unit is properly labeled or otherwise has a system, such as a log, to immediately identify the hazardous secondary materials in the unit, and the unit holds hazardous secondary materials that are compatible with other hazardous secondary materials placed in the unit and is compatible with the materials used to construct the unit and address any potential risks of fires or explosions. Finally, hazardous secondary materials in units that meet the hazardous waste tank and container standards are presumed to be contained. An overall goal of the DSW and its exclusions is to promote legitimate recycling. We will spend the next few slides discussing how legitimate recycling is defined. We can clarify what we mean by legitimate recycling through their counterexample of sham recycling. Sham recycling is an attempt to circumvent the rules that govern hazardous waste disposal by falsely characterizing the mishandling of hazardous waste as recycling. For example, during 1997 and 1998, 375 tons of lead-contaminated foundry sand were bagged and sold as play sand to 40 different retailers throughout Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. There are legitimate recycling options for foundry sand, which do provide benefits to companies, human health, and the environment. For example, in 2001, the EPA issued a memo clarifying that the reuse of foundry sands for mold making in a facility's sand loop following normal industry practices is legitimate reuse. That is legitimate recycling, and it is the kind of behavior that the rules are meant to enable and encourage. Here is another example of sham recycling. This is hazardous spent solvent contaminated with ink from a screen printing process designated by the generator as ugly paint or used thinner. The facility had no records of anyone taking the free ugly paint or used thinner. The materials were stored outside in containers covered with corrugated plastic. According to the owner, he was using the ugly paint on a concrete slab for an advertisement that would be visible by airplanes. The advertisement was never completed. The 2015 Legitimacy Standard included 4 codified factors. These were: hazardous secondary materials must provide a useful contribution to the recycling process or to a product or intermediate. Recycling must produce a valuable product or intermediate. Hazardous secondary materials must be managed as a valuable commodity. And the product of recycling must be comparable to a legitimate product or intermediate. The 2018 Final Rule vacated the fourth factor and reinstated the 2008 version. The fourth factor, again, stated that the product of recycling must be comparable to a legitimate product or intermediate. In the 2015 rule, this was a requirement that must be met to establish legitimacy. In the 2008 version of the rule, this was a consideration, not a requirement, in establishing legitimacy. The 2018 Final Rule now incorporates this factor as a consideration, not a requirement. The Legitimacy Standard includes built-in recognition of certain good recycling practices. Alternative management methods, such as super sacks instead of barrels, can be used to ensure a hazardous secondary material is handled as a valuable commodity when appropriate for the materials. Commodity standards can be used to determine that the product of a recycling process is comparable where appropriate. In-process recycling, such as closed-loop recycling, where the hazardous secondary material is returned to the industrial process from which it originated, does not require any further demonstration of comparability. When the product of the hazardous secondary material has higher levels of hazardous constituents than the product made from raw materials, but recycling is legitimate, the new standard allows documentation, including certification, to be kept on-site to demonstrate legitimacy, with notification to the regulatory agency. I would like to take a moment to review revisions to variances and non-waste determinations. Those revisions include requiring facilities to send a notice to the administrator or state director if the state is authorized and potentially reapply for a variance in the event of a change in circumstances that affects how a hazardous secondary material meets the criteria upon which solid waste variance has been based. Establishing a fixed term not to exceed 10 years for variance and non-waste determinations, at the end of which facilities must reapply for a variance or non-waste determination. Requiring facilities to re-notify every 2 years with updated information. Revising the criteria for the partial reclamation variance, and for the non-waste determination in 40 CFR 260.34, requiring that petitioners demonstrate why the existing solid waste exclusions would not apply to their hazardous secondary materials. I would like to turn now to the remanufacturing exclusion and its requirements. The remanufacturing exclusion focuses on the recycling of particular solvents. This exclusion was not part of the 2008 version of the DSW. It excludes from the definition of solid waste higher value hazardous solvents which are remanufactured into commercial grade products. This exclusion sets requirements and criteria for each of the following: the generator, the remanufacturer, and the use after remanufacturing. Let's begin with the generator. The generator must be a facility in one of the following 4 sectors: plastics material and resin manufacturing, pharmaceutical preparation manufacturing, paint and coating manufacturing, and all other basic organic chemical manufacturing. Why did the EPA select these sectors for the exclusion? These are all manufacturing sectors, not waste handling sectors, and they each use chemicals as inputs and processing aids. Companies that use and remanufacture these solvents are often co-located and closely integrated, which results in a high potential for beneficial recycling. The exclusion applies to a particular set of solvents shown here. Processing aid solvents assist in the reaction, extraction, purification, and blending of ingredients and reactive products, but are not themselves reacted. These processing aid solvents, once used, can then be remanufactured to commercial grade again. These higher value solvents were selected because there are existing markets for all of these solvents to be remanufactured to serve similar purposes to those of the original commercial grade materials. Some of these are building block chemicals manufactured in high volumes. Others are specialty chemicals. Why does the exclusion focus on these solvents? These solvents are used as chemical manufacturing and processing aids in significant volumes in the four selected sectors. For example, pharmaceutical manufacturers may use 100 kilograms of solvents to make 1 kilogram of active pharmaceutical ingredient. Because of their origin, these solvents are only lightly contaminated and need minimal processing to be returned to a commercial grade state. Greenhouse gas reductions and energy and resource savings result from maximizing the number of uses of a high purity grade chemical product as an aid to chemical manufacturing and processing. In order to qualify for the exclusion, the solvent must have originally been used in the generator's production process for one of the following activities: reacting, extracting, blending, purifying chemicals, or for rinsing out the process lines associated with these functions. Solvents used for these functions are only slightly contaminated, can be easily separated from other reaction components, and need minimal processing to be returned to a commercial grade state. The exclusion also entails requirements for the remanufacturer. The remanufacturer must also be a facility in one of the 4 allowed sectors for the generator. The remanufacturer can be the generator and can use the remanufactured solvent in its own process or sell it as a product. The exclusion also sets out requirements for allowable uses after remanufacturing. Allowable uses include reacting, extracting, blending, or purifying chemicals, or for rinsing out the process lines associated with these functions in the 4 sectors, or using them as an ingredient in a product in any sector. These remanufactured solvents cannot be used for cleaning or degreasing. This diagram provides a summary of the remanufacturing exclusion. First, the generator must use one of the 18 higher value hazardous solvents. They must use the solvent for reacting, extracting, blending, or purifying, and they must be in one of the 4 sectors. Next, the remanufacturer must be in one of the 4 sectors and can use the solvent in its own process or sell it as a product. Finally, after remanufacturing, the remanufactured solvent can be used for the 4 functions in the 4 sectors, or can be used as an ingredient in production in any sector. Now that concludes our overview of the requirements and criteria for facilities to qualify for the remanufacturing exclusion. Let's move on now to the specific notification, record-keeping, and operational provisions of the exclusion rule. First, remanufacturers must certify that the equipment complies with the Clean Air Act. And second, both generators and remanufacturers must maintain records of shipments and confirmation receipts for 3 years. Make a regulated waste activity notification using EPA Form 8700-12. Store and label tanks and containers according to RCRA regulations, and ensure that spent solvents are meeting applicable emission standards and meet the requirements prohibiting speculative accumulation. The remanufacturing exclusion also requires a remanufacturing plan. Both generators and remanufacturers must jointly develop and maintain a remanufacturing plan that identifies generator and remanufacturer, types of solvents and estimated annual volumes, processes and industry sectors that generate the spent solvents, specific uses and industry sectors for the remanufactured solvents, and certifies that all the requirements described in the prior slides are met. The remanufacturing exclusion can provide significant benefits. The potential cost savings include avoidance of hazardous waste disposal and shipping costs, reduction of the use of new solvents, income from selling spent solvent to the remanufacturer, or avoidance of costs associated with buying additional solvent, and reduced purchase prices from a remanufacturer. The potential environmental benefits include energy and resource conservation, which includes solvent recovery and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. States whose current rules are less stringent than the 2018 DSW rule will be required to adopt the more stringent provisions in the 2018 rule. Those more stringent provisions include prohibition of sham recycling and the definition of legitimate recycling, including the definition of contained, the accumulation date tracking requirement for speculative accumulation provisions, and changes to the standards and criteria for the solid waste variance and non-waste determinations. In general, the exclusions in the final rule do not go into effect until the authorized state adopts them. The EPA encourages states to develop and run their own hazardous waste programs as an alternative to direct EPA management. As we reach the end of this discussion, I'd like to take a moment to recap some of the benefits of DSW exclusions. One important benefit is the extension of the useful life of hazardous secondary materials. Exclusions that encourage reuse and recycling can help decouple growth in production from growth in waste generation. Enabling off-site reclamation removes a barrier to recycling that many companies could not otherwise overcome. Also, a national approach creates more opportunities and capacity for recycling. The context listed here can clarify any questions you have regarding the DSW rules. They are the DSW experts, and they understand all the ins and outs of the exclusions and the revisions. I would like to take the last few minutes of this webinar to talk about Penn TAP. The Pennsylvania Technical Assistance Program, Penn TAP, at Penn State is a federal, state, and university partnership to stimulate statewide economic development. Penn TAP helps organizations maximize their competitiveness through in-person consultations, unbiased technical advice, and connections to Penn State experts, resources, and programs. Penn TAP provides two categories of services: energy and environment, and innovation. Energy and environment services include P2E2 assessments, which are pollution prevention and energy efficiency assessments, E3, or economy, energy, and environment assessments, building retuning, and energy management systems. Innovation services include product and process improvement, the Learning Factory program, and student entrepreneurship. Penn TAP performs free pollution prevention and energy efficiency audits for manufacturers in Pennsylvania. The audit reports provide recommendations with cost savings, estimated project costs, and payback periods. For eligible companies, Penn TAP also provides assistance completing grant applications for project implementation. Penn TAP also provides E3 services, that's energy, environment, and economy. These projects combine energy audits, pollution prevention, and lean manufacturing to provide comprehensive process improvements. The Building Retuning Program, also called BRT, is a combination classroom and hands-on training opportunity for government agencies, including schools and municipalities. The program focuses on no and low-cost savings opportunities. Penn TAP also helps organizations to create and implement energy management systems, or EnMS. An EnMS is designed to help organizations take a systematic approach to achieving continual improvement in energy performance by creating a framework to integrate energy efficiency into existing management systems. An EnMS can help you establish the policies and procedures to plan, identify, prioritize, and implement projects that will improve your facility's energy performance. Formal recognition of a company's EnMS is accomplished using the ISO 50001 standard, the Superior Energy Performance Certification, and the Department of Energy's new 50001 Ready designation. SCP is a more rigorous energy performance certification developed by DOE that requires verified energy performance improvements. 50001 Ready is a designation for organizations that have implemented an ISO 50001-based EnMS using the 50001 Ready Navigator online tools. 50001 Ready is a great opportunity for companies that want the benefits of an EnMS without the ISO 50001 certification costs. Penn TAP had a great year in 2017. We outlined some of the highlights here. We completed 79 on-site engagements, including P2E2 assessments, E3 events, BRT sessions, and EnMS trainings. We reduced 1.8 million kilowatt hours of electricity consumption and the associated greenhouse gas emissions. We also enabled over $4 million in economic benefits. And we provided BRT training to over 100 registrants from school districts and municipalities. Now I would like to end with a brief overview of our innovation services. Penn TAP is in year 3 of a 5-year U.S. EDA University Center program to enhance and build economic development in Pennsylvania by leveraging Penn State resources with businesses and community partnerships. We do that by engaging students and faculty in technical design and operational efficiency projects to help entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs overcome hurdles. There are 21 innovation hubs located at PSU campuses around the Commonwealth to help with new business and new product creation. The Learning Factory does over 200 student team engineering design projects every year to help sponsors advance technical challenges toward viable solutions. There are mechanisms in place to allow for sponsors to retain all intellectual property that might be of value to the organization from the sponsored project. The Learning Factory has been engaging students with company sponsors for over 22 years. It allows student teams to demonstrate before graduation their abilities to perform in the work environment. It builds engagement networks between organizations and Penn State's faculty and staff. It enables small companies to benefit from inexpensive but high-quality engineering design services, and it gives companies a longer-term interview with potential students they may want to hire after graduation. "2017 was a great year for innovation services, and our impact continues to grow. By partnering with the Invent Penn State initiative, our ability to help organizations and entrepreneurs has broadened significantly around the Commonwealth. The INCU student entrepreneurship efforts have helped advance many student companies to the point where their student founders are working full-time after graduation, building their companies within Pennsylvania and beyond. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I am going to stay online for a few more minutes to take questions. Just enter questions in your chat pod, and I will monitor those for the next couple of minutes. I see a comment from Maria. Thank you for that feedback. Also, it looks like someone tried to raise their hand. I think you may be trying to ask a question. You might be able to do that in the Q&A box. I see that Don Cupp has raised his hand. Don, are you able to type a question into the webinar chat? Okay, I see a question coming in here. This might be from you, Don. As a small company and limited user of ethanol, how do I know if this whole concept discussed today will be of benefit? I think the best approach for that, Don, would be, depending on your location, to communicate with either your state agency or with the EPA. We do have contact information in the webinar, which will be available as a recording. So you'll be able to reach out to them and maybe give some additional information on the extent of your use, the circumstances of it, and they may be able to explain in more detail how these exclusions might apply to you. Also, as I mentioned, the EPA is finalizing their FAQ, so if you reach out to them, you'll be able to find out once those FAQs are ready, and those may also help. I see we still have a number of you online. I will wait another minute or two to see if there are any additional questions. Thank you all again for participating today. I'm going to bring the webinar to a close. There will be a recording available online, and we do have contact information both for us at PennTAP and also for the experts at the EPA. Feel free to reach out if you have questions and any feedback as well. We appreciate you taking the time to join us and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.